Wonderful. Hello, everyone. We are extremely excited to be here today. We are Anna and Hanna from Copenhagen Business School as well. And we propose a new concept in design thinking today called the diplomatic rebel. And by that, we move the frontiers of design thinking also into the business world. We had some speeches before in the business world, design thinking. However, we bring it into an innovation context of large organizations. And thereby, we introduce the diplomatic rebel. We were not the bright minds behind the concept itself. It actually comes from those two who founded the company Diplomatic Rebels in Copenhagen. And the idea was that, of those two founders, that innovation managers in large organizations face extremely many challenges. So they founded a fellowship program, which you could also understand as a mentorship program for intrapreneurs. So intrapreneurs are innovation managers in large organizations driving innovation forward. So they have the role to understand the problem, come up with solutions, and then also implement that innovation process in large organizations. And they found that there are many, many challenges when driving innovation in organizations. First of all, as we know, driving innovation, driving design thinking, you have to be a rebel. You have to understand that the status quo might need some change and fight for that, for those challenges to overcome innovation barriers in organizations. But they also understood that when doing that in large organizations, you actually need to be very diplomatic, meaning you have to bring people on board. You have to explain them why change is needed. And in order to help different intrapreneurs, so those entrepreneurs that drive innovation from within, to help those globally, they founded a fellowship program, as you can see here, where different intrapreneurs from different organizations come together on a regular basis in monthly meetings, for example, and then they spar on each other's, or spar together on the challenges of driving innovation. So that's the company that we investigated. The advantage of that was that by investigating the diplomatic rebels, we actually had access to many different innovation projects in large organizations. So our approach is quite unique as it spans both empirical findings of those case studies that we investigated in the different organizations, but also we go quite deep in a literature review and propose a new academic approach. So when we look at theory, we actually found out and understand through authors like Amabile that the innovation process can be understood as idea generation and implementation. Without implementation, innovation actually becomes redundant. Then it mainly remains an invention. So what's important here is the actual, is the actual implementation in organizations as well. And that's where we really expand the concept of design thinking. Because we understood that design thinking was brought to the business world to actually understand problems and come up with solutions. Design thinking helps organizations to do that more efficiently and come up with new solutions in the business world. However, and that's one of the largest critiques we also found in design thinking in the business world, it doesn't necessarily always explain the implementation part. So that's where we actually expand design thinking with management literature. So we went back into the business literature stream and actually found concepts from management that expand the design thinking field. So there was one concept that already existed that we found that comes quite close to what we are trying to say, which is ambidexterity, expanding exploration with exploitation. However, as Anna will explain you in a little while, we also go much further than the ambidexterity context by actually expanding with the diplomatic part. looking into the data analysis. So there were different entrepreneurs in different organizations, and we just wanted to give you some examples. These were the cases that we investigated and that we brought for today. We looked into 5 different cases, and I would like to actually come and start with the concept of Greg. So Greg works in Lego. You all know Lego, a very traditional toy brick company. And Greg understood that Lego actually is not future fit if they don't move into the digital world. So he recognized that the future of kid play, or play for kids, is actually in the digital world. Proposing that to the organization, he faced tremendous resistance. Everyone in the company said, this is not Lego, we can't do this. For 200 years we have been based on toy bricks, so we can't go about this digitization project. So what Greg did was he actually started a small tribe of passionate people, talking to them in a very empathetic way, making them understand why this transition is needed, and in their free time, they actually developed that project forward. And step by step, that tribe grew. More people became aware of why this transition is needed, up to the point that they actually created a small hype in Lego. So they started to print t-shirts. They also wore yellow sneakers. So when walking in the company, people saw there's a pattern here, something cool is going on, how can we be part of this? So Greg really understood what it means to bring those stakeholders on board. Otherwise, the project would have failed, as he would have faced resistance from all the stakeholders. And by the time the tribe grew and more employees wanted to be part of that digitization project, also management became aware of it. And actually, as we heard in the speech before, provided the important factors for innovation. So management was able to provide budget, resources, and actually also time and the official buy-in for the project to come to life. As another example, we, for example, also had Alex. She drove an innovation process in an entire global holding company, and she understood that innovation was previously driven in silos in each of the sub-companies. And she introduced an overall innovation board spanning all the different sub-companies and implemented an innovation strategy for the holding company. So you see, these are quite high management decisions these entrepreneurs actually make, large organizational strategies they drove forward, and we actually explain how this can also be understood in literature with the concept of diplomatic rebels.
Does this work now with you having that?
Yeah.
This is for Zoom, so maybe it's better to test it.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you have anywhere you can put it?
Yeah. Just clip it on.
Yeah.
Okay. Does this work? Yes, perfect. All right, so what we did was we interviewed all the diplomatic rebels, and then what we found was, looking at the mindsets, that all of them were really future-oriented. So they were trying to move their organizations towards a better future. And they were really optimistic in the way they did it, which was also reflected in a certain self-confidence. They had a holistic view. They had this idea of abductive reasoning, being experimental and explorative, going out there and trying, failing fast if they had to. They even went to the point when we go to risk-taking where they said, I'll do it even if I lose my job. So they were really going all in on it. And that was also, when we looked at the skills, we could see that they were all really good at thinking by doing, having a human-centered approach. They were quite into visualizing, where, for example, they used an approach called Lego Serious Play, or they kind of like made small prototypes for their projects. And they did quite well on collaborative work styles. But then there was certain things that we couldn't explain looking at this. Like, so on the left side, you see that all of the mindset and skills I just named, they relate to what we saw as design thinking. So we could see that this rebellious side was really reflected in design thinking. But then there was some aspects that we couldn't explain with design thinking. For example, when we look at the right side, there was a mindset of being very agreeable and strategic. So strategic related to that the diplomatic rebels were really good at understanding what does the organization need, what are the values, what is sort of like the numbers that I need to put behind my project to drive it forward. Whereas agreeableness really related to very strong empathetic. So they were really good at understanding where is my team at, what do they need, where is their emotional, where are their values. As Hanna talked about with the example with Greg, people resisted. So what he did, he built a tribe and he really got people on board. And that is also reflected in the skills, reflected in emotional intelligence and cultural awareness, as well as the rational intelligence, which relates to a strategic mindset. And they all had a really good communication skills with a strong storytelling narrative. So then we said, okay, well, if we can't explain everything with design thinking, maybe we need to turn to management literature to supplement what we were finding. And when we went back to literature, we found that if you see right here, this gray box here, that abductive reasoning and experimental and explorative mindset and the risk-taking mindset we couldn't find in management literature, which makes good sense because that is the exact reason why design thinking was brought to the management world, namely to kind of disrupt and bring new ideas and so on. But we also found that agreeableness, on the other hand, wasn't reflected in design thinking per se, which we thought was really interesting and actually one of the contributions we see that we bring. By bringing agreeableness to design thinking, we can also advance that field forward. And you might wonder, why is this like in a lighter gray? Well, we saw that the rebel was really good at collaborating. And of course, when we think about design thinking, we also talk about collaborating, but it is mostly about being empathetic towards external stakeholders. So for example, consumers. What design thinking in the business context doesn't talk about is being collaborative towards internal stakeholders, so your colleagues and your teams. So where does this lead? Well, we found that diplomatic rebels are really good at managing innovation in those two stages, in the idea generation and in the implementation stage. And why is that? Well, the rebel, with everything we've talked about now, is really strong at overcoming innovation barriers, with all the mindset and skills of being explorative, going out there, being risk-taking. But then when it comes to implementation, we point to the diplomat. Because of the agreeableness, they're really strong at managing resistance. So I'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. What does it mean? Well, we found that there were different innovation barriers. We found 3 innovation barriers. 1, the adoption barrier, the mindset barrier, and the risk barrier. In general, we see that around 70% of innovation fails in organizations, and that is oftentimes related to these barriers. And then the rebel comes in and they're able to overcome these. Because of the future-oriented thinking and the adaptive reasoning, they kind of challenge the norms, which relates to an adoption barrier in organizations. So it's organizations that have been doing things for years and years and years, like Lego has been in the toy brick industry for years and years. And they say, well, it's working, so why should we change things? The rebel comes and says, well, if we actually want to be future-facing and drive things forward, we need to change that. Similar, when we look at the mindset barrier, they have this explorative and experimental mindset. They're really risk-taking, so they are able to drive forward these, what we call obsolete mental models. This is not us. They're like, well, we got to change something. So then also when we look at risk-taking, they are just naturally better fit to kind of like embrace risk. But by driving change and innovation, they also stir resistance. They want to do things differently, and people just simply hate change. So what some of the interviewees said, well, they're just pushy, they're a little bit too pushy, they harm relationships, they're someone who likes to shine themselves, and kind of just that disruptive nature comes at the cost of sensitivity and empathy towards others. So that's where the diplomat comes in. We found 2 different stages of resistance that naturally comes as you'd want to drive innovation in organizations. Whereas one is called I don't get it, That's a very factual resistance, kind of like towards, I just don't understand why it's needed. And then I don't like it, which is an emotional resistance relating to the fear of losing your job because you might not be fit for the change situation. In literature, there is a third type of resistance called I don't like you, which then relates to the change maker. We couldn't find that though. And then the diplomat comes in and is actually really good at managing resistance because of everything we talked about. They're empathetic. They have this ability to involve and engage colleagues, as we talked about in the Lego example, where they really built a tribe and got people on board. They are strong in emotional intelligence as well as a strategic approach. And the one thing that we want to point out as well is this agreeableness. So really this possibility to be trustful and likable and help employees cope with change. So why do we talk about all of this in relation to design thinking? Well, we think that one of the main contributions is that while design thinking talks about empathy, the difference is that it focuses very much on the meaning-seeking needs of consumers, but it kind of neglects a little bit the impact of the internal stakeholder management, which is so much needed if you want to take design thinking into a management context. So we think that it's really important to kind of substitute or complement design thinking with the aspect of agreeableness. As a last point, we also looked into, we've been talking a lot about sort of, is it possible to be a rebel and a diplomat in one person? And as we talked about, there's ambidexterity literature that doesn't really come to a conclusion if it is possible, if it is not possible. What we found is that it can actually be unified within one person because of all our interviews saying that there was no inner bias. They all said that it was more complementary than conflicting, and that really kind of depended on the situation. So they said that it came quite natural to be more rebellious in the idea generation phase, where it also came quite natural to be more a diplomat when it came to implementation. So that is the concept of the diplomatic rebels. And I think we want to leave you with two things: that it could be interesting to look into a holistic concept that advances ambidexterity towards by the emotional intelligent diplomat, and also enhance possibly the academic conversation. And as a last point, I think what we've been talking a lot about is how do we see ourselves in this? Are we diplomatic rebels, and how does this relate to our everyday?